The last data type we're going to cover in this section is arrays. We use arrays to store a collection of elements, like a collection of numbers, dates, strings, and so on. So let's say we want to store a list of integers. If you want to store a single integer, we type int and then give our variable a name. But if you want to store a list of integers or an array of integers, right after our variable name, we type square brackets. And in between the brackets, we specify the number of items or the number of integers we want to store. Let's say 5. So this will allocate 5 integers right next to each other in memory, and we can access any of these using an index. Let me show you. First, let's print this array. And by the way, because here we're dealing with an array or a list of integers, it's better to use a plural name. This makes our code more clear and explicit. So we're going to change this to numbers. Okay? Now let's print numbers on the terminal and see what we get. What is that? Do you recognize this? We talked about this earlier in this section. This is a hexadecimal number because it starts with 0x. And this is the address of this array in memory. So if you take this hexadecimal number and convert it to a decimal number, that number represents the address of this array in memory. Okay? Now, we can access individual elements in this array using square brackets. So right here, if we type square brackets 0, we can access the first element. Take a look. So the first element is initialized to 0. What about the second element? We use the index of 1. Take a look. That is also 0 as well. So all the elements in this array are initialized to 0 by default, okay? But we can change any of these values. For example, we can set the second element to 10. Now, take a look. So we get 10 on the terminal, okay? So the first element has the index of 0, and the last element has the index of 4, which is equivalent to the size of the array minus 1, okay? Now, what if we access an element outside of this range? For example, we use the index of 5. Well, we immediately see a warning saying array index 5 is past the end of the array. However, our program still compiles. If we run it, we get some garbage value on the terminal. So this is one of the areas that C++ is different from languages like C# or Java. More modern languages prevent us from accidentally accessing an element outside of an array. So our code doesn't get compiled. But in C++, this is totally fine. So we programmers have to be careful about this kind of scenarios. So there's more responsibility on our shoulders, okay? So this is how we can access individual elements. Now, just like other variables, we can initialize an array right here. So we can set this to curly braces, and inside the braces, we can provide a list of values, let's say 10 and 20. With this, we are setting the first element to 10 and the second element to 20. Also, CLion shows the index of first and second elements, okay? Now, the other elements, as you saw, are initialized to 0 by default. So let me delete this line. We don't need it anymore. And let's print the first element. That's going to be 10. Let's verify it. There you go. Now, if you access the third element, which has the index of 2, you can see that it's initialized to 0. Now, when initializing arrays, we don't have to specify the size here. So if we remove 5, we let the compiler figure out how many elements we need in this array. In this case, 2. That's why we have a warning over here, because we're trying to access the third element. And this array has only 2 elements, okay? So here's what you need to take away. If you have all the initial values, you don't have to provide a size. But if you don't have all the initial values and you want to reserve enough space for storing all the elements, then you have to specify a size here. So this was the basics of working with arrays. In the future, we'll explore arrays in more detail. Now, as your exercise, I want you to write a program that asks the user for 3 names. Store these names inside an array and then print the first name. It's very easy. It should only take a couple of minutes. All right, for storing these names, we need a string array. So string, we're going to call that names. So note that here we are using a plural name. Then here we have to specify the size because we don't have the initial values, right? So here's our array. Now we're going to read 3 names. So First, we print a label, name. Next, we can use cin or getLine to read a name. It doesn't really matter. So we read the first name and store it in names of 0. Okay? Now we need to repeat. So I'm going to select these 2 lines. Now, if you're using a Mac, you can press Command and D. If you're on Windows, you can press Control and D if you're using CLion, and this will duplicate these lines. Okay? Now, just like before, I would like to add a vertical line break to separate this story from the second story. So here we read the second name and store it in names of 1. And one more time, we read the third name and store it in names of 2. And finally, we print the first name. So names of 0. Very simple exercise. I just wanted you to get comfortable with arrays. Now let's run our program and see how it works. So the first name is John, then Bob and Mary, and we see the first name on the terminal. Beautiful.